Okay, Dragonsong, Chapter 3. When Manoli finally got back to the sea hold, the sky was darkening. The hall was bustling with the usual end-of-day activity. The oldsters were setting the dinner tables, tidying the great hall, and chattering away as if they hadn't met for turns instead of only that morning. With luck, thought Manoli, she could get her sack down to the water rooms. "Where did you go for those greens, Manoli? Narat?" Her mother appeared in front of her. "Almost." Immediately, Manoli saw that her pert words were ill-timed. Mavi roughly grabbed the sack and peered inside critically. "If you'd not made the trip worth the while. Sail's been sighted." "Sail?" Mavi closed the sack and shoved it back into Manoli's hands. "Yes, sail. You should have been back hours ago. Whatever possessed you to take off so far with thread? There weren't any greens nearer." "With thread due to fall any time? You're a fool twice over." "I was safe enough. I saw a dragon rider doing a sweep." That pleased Mavi. "Thank heavens we're beholden to Bendon. They're a proper weir." Mavi gave her daughter a shove toward the kitchen level. "Take those, and be sure the girls wash every speck of sand off. Who knows who's sailing in?" Manoli slipped through the busy kitchen, countering orders flung at her by various other women who saw in her a capable assistant at their own tasks. Manoli merely brandished the sack and proceeded down to the water rooms. There some of the older but still able women were busily sand scouring the best metal plates and trays. "I must have one basin for the greens, Auntie," said Manoli, pushing up to the rank of stone sinks. "Greens is easier on old skin than sand," said one of the women in a quavering, long-suffering voice, and promptly deposited her pile of plates into the sink beside her and pulled her plug. "More sand and greens than cleaning," another woman remarked in an acid tone. "Yes, but take it off greens," said the obliging one. "Oh, what a lovely mess of yellow veins, too. Where did you find them this time of year, daughter?" "Halfway to Narad." Manoli suppressed her grin at their startled shrieks of dismay. The furthest they'd serve from the hold was the ledge in front of on a sunny day. "With the red falling? You naughty girl! Did you hear about the sale? Who do you suppose? The new harper? Who else?" There was a wild chorus of cackling laughs and great wonderings about the appearance of the new harper. "They always send a young one here. Paterian was old. He got that way, same as we did. How would you remember? Why not? I've lived through more harpers than you have, my girl." "You have not. I came here from Red Sands in Ista. You were born at Half Circle, you old fool, and I birthed you. Ha!" Manoli listened to the four old women arguing back and forth until she heard her mother demanding to know if the greens had been washed, and where were the good plates, and how was she to get anything done with all the gossip. Manoli found a...
Yeah, that's actually true.
Manoli found a sieve large enough to hold the washed greens and brought them up for her mother's inspection. "Well, that'll be enough for the head table," Mavi said, poking at the glistening mound with her fork. Then she stared at her daughter. "You can't appear like that. Here, you, Barty, take the greens and put the dressing on them. The one in the brown flask on the fourth shelf in the cool room. You, Manoli, have the goodness to get yourself sand-free and decently dressed. You're to attend old uncle. The moment he opens his mouth, shove something into it or we'll be hearing him all night long." Manoli grinned. Old uncle smelled almost as much as she chattered. "Sella's much better at handling him, Mavi. Sella's to attend head table. You do as you're told and be grateful." Mavi fixed her rebellious daughter with a stern eye, tacitly reminding her of her disgrace. Then Mavi was called away to check a sauce for the baking fish. Manoli went off to the bathing rooms, trying to convince herself that she was lucky she hadn't been banished completely from the hall this evening, though tending old uncle came as close as could be to banishment. Honor obliged the seaholder to have all his household there to greet the new harper. Manoli shucked off the dirty tunic and breeches and slipped into the warm bathing pool. She swung her shoulders this way and that for the water to wash the sand and sweat as painlessly as possible from her sore back. Her hair was all gritty with sea sand, too, so she washed that. She was quick because she'd have her hands full with old uncle. It'd be much better to have him all arranged in his hearth seat before everyone else assembled for dinner. Draping her dirty clothes around her, Manoli took the calculated risk that few people would be in the high hold at this hour and charged up the dimly lit steps from the bathing pools to the sleeping level. Every glow in the main corridor was uncovered, which meant that the Harper, if such it were, would have a guided tour of the hold later. She dashed down to the narrow steps leading to the girls' dormitories and got into her cubicle without a soul the wiser. When she got to old Uncle's room later, she had to clean his face and hands and slip a clean tunic over his bony shoulders. All the while he was chattering about a new blood in the hold and who was the new Harper going to marry? He'd have a thing or two to tell the Harper, give him the chance, and why did she have to be so rough? His bones ached. Must be a change in the weather because his old legs never failed to give warning. Hadn't he warned them about the big storm a while back? 2 boats had been lost with all the crew. If they'd paid attention to his warning, it wouldn't have happened. His own son was the worst one for not listening to what his father said, and why was she hurrying him so? He liked to take his time. No, couldn't he have the blue tunic? The one his daughter had made him, matching his eyes, she'd said. And why hadn't Terlan come to see him today as he'd asked and asked and asked, but who paid him any heed anymore? The old man was so frail that he was no burden to a strong girl like Manoli. She carried him down the steps, he complaining all the way about people who'd been dead before she was born. Old Uncle's notion of time was distorted. That's what Paterian had told her. Brightest in Uncle's memory were his earlier days, when he'd been sea holder of Half Circle, before a tangled trawler line had sliced off his legs before the knee. The great hall was almost ready for guests when Manoli entered with him. "They're tacking into dock," someone was saying, as Manoli arranged old Uncle in his special seat by the fire. She wrapped him well in the softened ware hides and tied the strap that would keep him upright. When he got excited, old Uncle had a tendency to forget he had no feet. "Who's tacking into dock? Who's coming? What's all the hubble-bubble about?" Manoli told him, and he subsided, moments later wanting to know in a querulous tone of voice if anyone was going to feed him or if he was supposed to sit here dinnerless. Sella, in the gown she'd spent all winter making, swirled past Manoli, pressing a small packet into her hand. "Feed him these if he gets difficult," and she skimmed away before Manoli could say a word. Opening the packet, Manoli saw balls of a sweet made from seaweed, flavored with purple grass seed. One could chew these for hours, keeping the mouth fresh and moist. Small wonder Sella had been able to keep old Uncle happy. Manoli giggled and then wondered why Sella was being so helpful. It must have pleased Sella no end to learn Manoli had been displaced as Harper. Or would she know? Mavi wouldn't have mentioned it. But the Harper was here now anyhow. Now that she had old Uncle settled, Manoli's curiosity got the better of her and she slipped over to the windows. There was no sign of the sail in the harbor now, but she could see the cluster of men, glows held high as they walked around the shore from the dock to the hold proper. Keen though her eyes were, Manoli could not pick out the new faces, and that was that. Old Uncle began one of his monologues in a high-pitched voice, so Manoli scooted back to his side before her mother could notice she'd left her post. There was so much bustle, putting food on the tables, pouring the welcoming cups of wine, all the hold arranging itself to meet the guests. No one noticed what Manoli was or wasn't doing. Just then, old Uncle came to himself again, eyes bright and focused on her face. "What's the stir today, girl? Good haul? Someone getting spliced? What's the lay?" "There's a new Harper coming, everyone thinks, old Uncle." "Not another one." Old Uncle was disgusted. "Harpers ain't what they used to be when I was sea holder, not by a long crack. I mind myself of one Harper we had." His voice fell clearly in the suddenly quiet hall. "Manoli." Her mother's voice was low, but the urgency was unmistakable. Manoli fumbled in her skirt pocket, found 2 sweet balls, and popped them into old Uncle's mouth. Whatever he'd been about to say was stopped by the necessity of dealing with 2 large round objects. He mumbled contentedly to himself as he chewed and chewed and chewed. All the food had been served and everyone seated before Manoli got so much as a glimpse of the new arrivals.
Blasphemy is still blasphemy, even if you're too old to know it's blasphemy.
There had been a new Harper. She heard his name before she ever saw his face. Elgian, Harper Elgian. She heard that he was young and good-looking and had brought 2 guitars, 2 wooden pipes, and 3 drums, each carried separately in its own case of stiffened warehide. She heard that he'd been very seasick across Karoon Bay and wasn't doing justice to the lavish dinner spread in his honor. With him had come a craftmaster from the Smith Craft Hall to do the metalwork required on the new ship and other repairs beyond the metalmen in the sea hold. She heard that there was urgent need at Egan Hold for any salted or smoked fish the Sea-Hold might have to spare on the return voyage. From where Manoli sat with Old Uncle, she could see the backs of heads at the high table and occasionally a profile of one of the visitors. Very frustrating. So was Old Uncle and the other elderly relatives whose old bones rated them a spot near the fire. The aunts were, as usual, squabbling over who would receive the choicer portions of fish, and then Old Uncle decided to call them to order, only his mouth was full at that moment and he choked. So the aunts turned on Manoli for trying to stuff him to an early death. Manoli could hear nothing over their babble. She tried to content herself with the prospect of hearing the harper sing, as he surely would once the interminable meal was ended. But it was hot so close to the big fire, and the heat made Old Uncle smell worse than ever, and she was very tired after the day's exertions. She was roused from a half-doze by a sudden hall-wide thudding of heavy sea boots. She jerked fully awake to see the tall figure of the new harper rising at the head table. He had his guitar ready and was taking an easy stance, one foot on the stone bench. "You're sure this hull isn't rocking?" he asked, strumming a few chords to test the instrument's pitch. He was assured that the hull had been steady for many, many turns, never known to rock at all. The harper affected not to be reassured as he tuned the G-string slightly higher, to Manoli's relief. He made the guitar moan then, like a seasick soul. As laughter rippled through the eager audience, Manoli strained to see how her father was taking this approach. The sea-holder had little humor. A harper's welcome was a serious occasion, and Elgian did not appear to realize this. Petirian had often told Manoli how carefully harpers were chosen for the hold they were assigned to. Hadn't anyone warned Elgian about her father's temperament? Suddenly, Old Uncle cut across the gentle strumming with a cackle of laughter. "Ha! A man with humor! That's what we need in this hold, some laughter, some music. Been missing it. Let's have some rollicking tunes, some funny songs. Give us a good rib-popping ditty, harper. You know the ones I like." Manoli was aghast. She fumbled in her skirt pocket for some of the sweet balls as she shushed Old Uncle. This was exactly the sort of incident that she was supposed to prevent. Harper Elgian had turned at the imperious order, bowing with good respect to the old gentleman by the hearth. "I would that I could, Old Uncle," he said most courteously, "but these are serious times." And his fingers plucked deep somber notes. "Very serious times, and we must put lightness and laughter behind us. Square our backs to the problems that face us." And with that he swung into a new exhortation to obey the weir and honor the dragon rider. The sticky sweet balls had got warmed and stuck to the fabric of her pocket, but Manoli finally got some out and into Old Uncle's mouth. He chewed angrily, fully aware that his mouth was being plugged and resenting it. He chewed as fast as he could, swallowing to clear his mouth for more complaints. Manoli was only just aware that the new tune was forceful, the words stirring. Harper Elgian had a rich tenor voice, strong and sure. Then Old Uncle began to hiccup, noisily of course, and to complain, or try to, through the hiccups. Manoli hissed at him to hold his breath, but he was furious at not being allowed to talk, at getting hiccups, and he started to pound the arm of his chair. The thumps made an out-of-tempo counterpoint to the harper's song and brought her furious glares from the head table. One of the aunts gave her some water for the old man, which he overturned on Manoli. The next thing, Sella was beside her, gesturing that they were to take the old man back to his quarters instantly. He was still hiccuping as they put him back to bed, and still beating the air with punctuated gestures and half-uttered complaints. "You'll have to stay with him until he calms down, Manoli, or he'll fall out of bed. Why ever didn't you give him the sweet balls? They always shut him up," Sella said. "I did. They're what started him hiccuping." "You can't do anything right, can you? Please, Sella, you stay with him. You manage him so well. I've had him all evening and not heard a word. You were told to keep him quiet. You didn't. You stay." And Sella swept out of the room, leaving Manoli to cope. That was the end of the first of Manoli's difficult days. It took hours for the old man to calm down and go to sleep. Then, as Manoli wearily got to her cubicle, her mother arrived to berate her soundly for the inattention that had given Uncle a chance to embarrass the entire hold. Manoli was given no chance to explain. The next day thread fell, sequestering them all within the hold for hours. When the fall was over, she had to go with the flamethrower crews. The leading edge of thread had tipped the marshes, which meant hours of plodding through sticky marsh mud and slimy sand. She was tired enough when she returned from the task, but then they all had to help load the big nets and ready the boats for a night trawl. The tide was right then. She was roused before sunrise the next morning to gut and salt the phenomenal catch. That took all the livelong day and sent her to bed so weary she just stripped off her dirty clothes and dropped into her sleeping furs. The next day was devoted to net mending, normally a pleasant task because the Hold women could chat and sing. But her father was anxious for the nets to be repaired quickly so that he could take the evening tide again for another deep-sea cast. Everyone bent to his work without time for talk or singing while the sea-holder prowled among them. He seemed to watch Manoli more often than anyone else, and she felt clumsy. It was then that she began to wonder if perhaps the new harper had found fault with the way the youngsters had been taught their ballads and sagas. Time and again Petirian had told her that there was only one way to teach them, and as she had learned properly from him, she must have passed on the knowledge correctly. Why then did her father seem to be so annoyed with her? Why did he glare at her so much? Was he still angry with her for letting old Uncle babble? She worried enough to ask her sister about it that evening when the ships had finally set sail and everyone else could relax a little. Angry about old Uncle, Sella shrugged. What on earth are you talking about, girl? Who remembers that? You think entirely too much about yourself, Manoli. That's your biggest problem. Why should Yanis care one way or another about you? The scorn in Sella's voice reminded Manoli too acutely that she was only a girl, too big for a proper girl, and the youngest of a large family, therefore of least account. It was in no way a consolation to be insignificant, even if her father was, for that reason, less likely to notice her, or remember her misdeeds. Except that he'd remembered about her singing her own songs to the youngsters, or had Sella forgotten that? Or did Sella even know that? Probably, thought Manoli as she tried to find a comfortable spot in the old bed rushes for her weary body. But then what Sella said about Manoli thinking only of herself applied even more to Sella, who was always thinking about her appearance and herself. Sella was old enough to be married to some advantage to the Hold. Her father had only 3 fosterlings at the moment, but 4 of Manoli's 6 brothers were out at other sea holds learning their trade. Now, with a harper to speak for them all again, perhaps there'd be some arrangements. The next day the Hold women spent in washing clothes. With threadfall past and a good clear sunny day, they could count on fast drying. Manoli hoped for a chance to speak to her mother to find out if the harper had faulted her teaching, but the opportunity never arose. Instead, Manoli came in for another scolding from Mavi for the state of her clothes, unmended, her bed furs unaired, her hair, her sloppy appearance, and her slothfulness in general. That evening, Manoli was quite content to take a bowl of soup and disappear into a shadowy corner of the big kitchen rather than be noticed again. She kept wondering why she was being singled out for so much misunderstanding. Her thoughts kept returning to the sin of having strummed a few bars of her own song. That, and being a girl, and the only one who could teach or play in the absence of a real harper. Yes, she finally decided that was the reason for her universal disfavor. No one wanted the harper to know that the youngsters had been schooled by a girl. But if she hadn't taught them right, then Petirian had taught her all wrong. That didn't hold water. And if the old man had really written the master harper about her, wouldn't the new harper have been curious or sought her out? Maybe her songs hadn't been as good as old Petirian had thought. Probably Petirian had never sent them to the master harper, and that message hadn't said anything about her. At any rate, the packet was now gone from the mantel in the records room, and the way things were going, Manoli would never get close enough to Elgian to introduce herself. Sure as the sun came up, Manoli could guess what she'd have to do the next day. Gather new grasses and rushes to repack all the beds in the hold. It was just the sort of thing her mother would think of for someone so out of favor. She was wrong. The ships came back to port just after dawn, their holds packed with yellow stripe and packtails. The entire hold was turned out to gut, salt, and start the smoke cave.
I want Nutella. Can I eat some?
Give me just, we're almost done. Hold on just a second. A little bit.
Yay.
Of all the fish in the sea, Manoli detested packtails the most. An ugly fish with sharp spines all over it. It oozed an oily slime that ate into the flesh of your hands and made the skin peel off. Packtails were more head and mouth than anything else, but hack the front end off and the rounded blunt tail could be sliced off the backbone. Grilled fresh, it was succulent eating. Smoked, it could be softened later for baking or boiling and be as tasty as the day it was caught. But packtails were the messiest, hardest, toughest, smelliest fish to gut. Halfway through the morning, Manoli's knife slipped across the fish she was slicing, gashing her left palm wide open. The pain and shock were so great that Manoli just stood, stupidly staring at her hand bones, until Sella realized that she wasn't keeping pace with the others. Manoli, just dreaming. Oh, for the love of... Mavi! Mavi! Sella could be irritating, but she could keep her wits, as she did now, grabbing Manoli's wrist and stopping the spurt of blood from the severed artery. As Mavi came and led her past the furiously working holders, Manoli was seized with a sense of guilt. Everyone glared at her as if she'd deliberately wounded herself to get out of working. The humiliation and silent accusations brought tears to her eyes, not the pain nor the sick feeling in her hand. "I didn't do it on purpose," Manoli blurted out to her mother as they reached the Hold's infirmary. Her mother stared at her. "Who said that you did?" "No one. They just looked it." "My girl, you think entirely too much about yourself. I assure you that no one was thinking any such thing. Now hold your hand so for a moment." The blood spurted up as Mavi released the pressure on the tendon in Manoli's wrist. For one instant, Manoli thought she might faint, but she was determined not to think of herself again. She pretended that she didn't own the hand that Mavi was going to have to fix. Mavi now deftly fashioned a tourniquet and then laved the wound with a pungent herbal lotion. Manoli's hand began to numb, increasing her detachment from the injury. The bleeding ceased, but somehow Manoli couldn't bring herself to look into the wound. Instead, she watched the intent expression on her mother's face as she quickly stitched the severed blood vessels and closed the long slice. Then she slathered quantities of salve on the cut and bound the hand in soft cloths. "There. Let's hope I got all that pack-tail slime out of the wound." Concern and doubt caused Mavi to frown, and Manoli became fearful. Suddenly she remembered other things. Women losing fingers, and "My hand will be all right, won't it?" "We'll hope so." Mavi never lied, and the small, hard ball of sick fear began to unknot in Manoli's stomach. "You should have some use of it. Enough for all practical purposes." "What do you mean, practical purposes? Won't I be able to play again?" "Play?" Mavi gave her daughter a long, hard stare, as if she'd mentioned something forbidden. "Your playing days are over, Manoli. You're way past the teaching." "But the new harper has new songs. The ballad he sang the first night, I never heard all of it. I don't know the chording. I want to learn." She broke off, horribly frightened by the closed look on her mother's face and the shine of pity in her eyes. "Even if your fingers will work after that slice, you won't be playing again. Content yourself that Yanis was so indulgent while old Peterian was dying." "But Peterian—" "That's enough buts. Here, drink this. I want you in your bed before it puts you to sleep. You've lost a lot of blood, and I can't have you fainting away on me." Stunned by her mother's words, Manoli barely tasted the bitter wine and weed. She stumbled, even with her mother's help, up the stone steps to her cubicle. She was cold despite the furs, cold in spirit. But the wine and weed had been liberally mixed, and she couldn't fight the effect. Her last conscious thought was of misery, of being cheated of the one thing that had made her life bearable. She knew now what a dragonless rider must feel like.
So we know the